My dad left me in the rain 35 miles from home. He said I needed a lesson. I didn't argue, I just stood there soaked to the bone, watching his taillights vanish into the dark. The storm pounded against me, cold needles driving into my skin, but the silence he left was louder. Then I heard it, the low growl of a black truck easing onto the shoulder. The door opened and my bodyguard stepped out, calm, steady, ready. That was when I smiled. My father thought he'd broken me. He didn't realize he'd just made his last mistake. My name is Claire Harlow, and I grew up in a house where silence was louder than shouting. My father believed discipline was a language, and he spoke it fluently. Richard Harlow, retired officer, iron spine, iron rules. To everyone else, he was respectable, honorable, the kind of man who straightened his tie before shaking hands. To me, he was a storm that never cleared. I was born the second child. That meant I was measured against Lucas before I could even spell my own name. He was the golden boy, the son who inherited Dad's jawline, his shoulders, his appetite for winning. Lucas could stumble through a project half-finished and still be called a leader. I could design an entire room from floorboards to ceiling moldings, but my father's eyes would skim over it like wallpaper. I was 9 when I realized I didn't exist in his world unless I failed. Failures were lessons. Successes were accidents. I still remember the day I lost that art competition. I had worked for weeks on the sketch graphite smudged into the side of my hand eraser crumbs dusting my lap. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. The judges awarded me nothing. That evening, outside the crowded stadium, I clutched my rolled-up drawing waiting by the exit where the cars lined up. The air smelled like popcorn and damp concrete. When Lucas finally appeared, Dad's hand heavy on his shoulder, they walked right past me. Lucas had played in some scrimmage game, nothing important, but Dad was beaming like he'd carried the team to glory. I ran after them, calling Dad, "Wait." He turned eyes, sharp mouth, already pulled tight. "You lost Claire. You don't ride home with winners." And he drove away. I sat on the curb for hours until a janitor took pity and let me call Mom. That was the first time I understood abandonment wasn't an accident in my family. It was a tool. Years later, nothing changed. Lucas got a new car on his 18th birthday, a gleaming black BMW with a ribbon big enough to wrap a house. The same week, I turned 21. Dad handed me a plain envelope with a check barely enough to cover 1 month's rent on my shoebox apartment. "Be responsible," he said, as if I hadn't been paying my own bills since I was 17. Mom stayed silent always. She'd clear the dishes, keep her eyes down as though ignoring the cracks in the family made her less guilty. Her silence became the wallpaper I grew up staring at, always there, never comforting. By 29, I had carved out my own life, small but real. I worked freelance as an interior designer. My clients were young couples, coffee shops, boutique stores, trying to look more expensive than they were. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Every time I finished a project, I'd take photos, save them to a folder labeled "Proof I Exist." But Dad only saw instability. A real job has a paycheck, he'd say, tapping the newspaper classifieds like they were holy scripture. You're playing house while your brother runs a company. That company was a construction firm. Harlow and Son, though, the "and Son" part was a fantasy. Dad still signed every paper, barked every order. Lucas was just the face-charming social quick to shake hands and slap backs. I suspected he was in over his head, but I didn't know how deep until much later. The night of Dad's 60th birthday, the whole extended family gathered at the Rosemont Hotel downtown. Chandeliers glittered above linen-draped tables. Waiters in black vests carried trays of champagne flutes that never seemed to empty. My father wore his best Navy suit medals gleaming on his lapel like he was still reporting for duty. He stood taller than everyone, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, receiving compliments like tribute. I wore a simple black dress, nothing flashy hair pulled back low. I wasn't trying to compete. I was just trying to belong. But I knew better the second I walked in. The main table was long covered in white lilies and crystal bowls. Place cards with gold lettering spelled out Richard Lucas Margaret for my mother, even Lorraine, my estranged aunt who hadn't been invited to anything in years. but my card wasn't there. I asked a server quietly, and he pointed toward the back. A small table near the service door next to the ice buckets and stacked trays. My name card waited there. That was Dad's way of teaching me position without saying a word. I sat down, spine straight, hands folded. The clinking of glasses and bursts of laughter filled the room, but where I sat, the air smelled of bleach and melting ice. When the speeches started, Dad cleared his throat into the microphone. His voice carried the weight of authority even at a birthday party. 60 years, he said. A man is measured by the strength of his family, the honor of his son, and the respect of his peers. He called Lucas forward, slipped the chain of an antique pocket watch into his palm, the same watch that had belonged to my grandfather. I felt my stomach tighten. That watch had been dangled in front of me since childhood, a symbol of everything I wasn't. This, Dad said, proudly belongs to the one who carries the Harlow name with pride. Applause swelled. Lucas grinned, holding up the watch like a trophy. I caught Aunt Lorraine's eyes across the room, her lips pressed tight, almost a grimace. Then Dad's gaze landed on me. "Claire," he said, voice lighter, almost joking. "You can watch from the family table in the back. Maybe one day you'll earn a seat." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough. My skin burned hotter than the candles on the cake. I pushed back my chair, the legs screeching against marble. And that was the moment something in me finally broke, not with a scream, but with silence sharp enough to cut. The applause still rang in my ears as I left the banquet hall. My heels clicked against the marble, echoing louder than they should have. Outside the hotel's revolving doors, the night smelled of exhaust and damp leaves. Portland rain had already started misting the streetlights, turning them into blurred halos. I stood there a long moment, the sound of muffled laughter leaking through the glass behind me. Inside, my family toasted themselves. Outside, I felt like a ghost, except ghosts are remembered. Dad eventually appeared, coat over one arm, Lucas swaggering behind him with the pocket watch chain dangling from his hand. He didn't even look at me as he slid into the back of the car. "Get in," Dad ordered. I did. But I didn't speak. The drive back to the house was silent except for windshield wipers dragging across glass. I watched raindrops streak sideways, racing each other to the edge. My reflection stared back at me from the window hair pinned too tight, lipstick smudged at the corner. "You embarrass me tonight," Dad said suddenly, voice low but sharp. I turned slowly. "By existing," his jaw flexed, "by making a scene. You don't leave in the middle of a speech. You don't sulk like a child." "I didn't sulk," I said. "I left." Lucas snorted beside him. Same thing. I looked at my brother, the golden boy teeth, perfect suit, cut sharp. He twirled that watch chain between his fingers like he'd been born to it. Dad's eyes cut to me again. "You'll learn respect if it kills you. Consider yourself on probation in this family." Probation, like I was an inmate. I stared at the dashboard clock ticking closer to midnight. The car heater blew hot air that made my throat dry. Somewhere in me, a pressure built, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that calcifies, turns to stone. We drove past downtown lights, then into darker stretches of road lined with dripping pine trees. My chest tightened with every mile. Dad had a way of turning silence into punishment. It worked on Mom, on Lucas, on everyone. For years, it worked on me, too. But tonight was different. The rain-thickened drops slamming harder against the roof. The road slicked black. "Pull over," Dad said suddenly. The driver hesitated. I said, "Pull over," tires hissed as we veered onto the shoulder. I gripped the door handle, pulse in my throat. Dad turned his face, half shadow, half headlight glow. "Out," he said. "What, you want to walk out of speeches? Walk home. 35 miles. Maybe the rain will rinse that attitude off." I felt Lucas's eyes on me waiting for my reaction. Maybe he expected me to beg, to argue, to plead. I didn't. I opened the door. Rain sliced sideways, soaking my dress in seconds. Cold bit down to my bones. I stood there, hair plastered to my cheek, mascara running, but my face was still. Dad leaned across the seat. "Consider this your lesson." The door slammed shut. The taillights flared, then shrank into the dark. For a moment, the night swallowed everything. No sound but the rain pounding gravel. No light but the red glow vanishing into trees. I could have screamed. I could have run after them. Instead, I stood still, arms limp at my sides. My breath fogged white in the air. The gravel shoulder turned to slurry under my shoes. Water crept cold into my socks. I thought of that night when I was 10, left outside the stadium. Same lesson, different decade. But this time, I wasn't a child. Headlights approached in the distance. For a second, I thought they'd come back. But the beams ghosted past indifferent throwing shadows across wet bark before vanishing. My phone was dead. Dad had accidentally swapped my charger earlier. My wallet was missing from my purse. He'd planned this, every detail. I whispered to the rain, so be it. That's when I saw it. A black truck, rolling slow tires, whispering over the grit. It pulled onto the shoulder ahead of me. Headlights cut out. My chest tightened. I braced to run. The driver's door opened with a heavy creak. A tall silhouette stepped out, rain dripping off a dark coat. "Miss Harlow," he said. The voice was steady, calm, familiar. Thomas Gray. My father's former security detail, the man who'd always lingered at the edges of our family events, silent as shadow. I hadn't seen him in months. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "Watching," he said simply, "making sure lines aren't crossed." I gave a bitter laugh. "You're late." His gaze didn't waver. "No, right on time." He held open the truck door. Warm air spilled out, smelling faintly of leather and pine. I climbed in without wiping my face. My body shook so hard I hugged myself, but inside me, something steadier than heat started to form. As Thomas pulled back onto the road, I glanced in the side mirror. The rain slashed white lines across the empty highway tally marks, counting down to something inevitable. "Did he really leave you here?" Thomas asked quietly. I nodded once. My throat was raw. He didn't push. He just drove. The truck hummed, steady headlights carving tunnels through the storm. My breath evened out against the heater vent, though my pulse still raced. Minutes passed. Miles blurred. My father believed abandonment was education. He didn't realize he'd just enrolled in mine. Thomas broke the silence. "Where do you want to go?" I stared at the windshield water streaking like veins. Anywhere but back there. He gave a short nod, like that was the answer he'd been waiting for. We drove on. The rain softened, but inside me the storm kept building. Every memory came back sharper than glass. Dad sneering at my art. Dad scoffing at my career. Dad laughing when I said no. Each one stacked like bricks in a wall I no longer wanted to climb. I pressed my palm to the window, feeling the cold seep through. My reflection stared back. Not broken, not pleading, just awake. By the time city lights flickered on the horizon, I knew. I wasn't going home. Not to that house. Not to that man. And I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. But silence could still be my weapon. Because silence in the right hands isn't surrender. It's a mirror. And soon my father would be forced to see himself in it. The hotel's chandeliers glittered like they'd been hung to blind me. Every clink of silverware, every polite laugh pressed deeper into my chest. I sat at the back table close enough to hear every word, but far enough that no one looked my way. Dad thrived on that kind of staging one spotlight, one humiliation, everyone else pretending it was normal. When he held up the pocket watch and handed it to Lucas, my breath snagged. For years, that watch had been more than metal and gears. It was the story of who mattered and who didn't. My grandfather used to polish it every night, whispering that honor was measured in how you carried your name. I was a child the first time I reached for it. Dad slapped my hand away. "Earn it," he said. Now he pressed it into Lucas's palm like it was destiny. Applause scattered through the room. Champagne fizzed in glasses. My Aunt Lorraine shook her head almost imperceptibly, but her silence didn't soften the sting. Then came the joke. "Claire can watch from the back until she earns her place." The laugh that followed wasn't loud, but it cut sharper than any shout. My hands went cold. I pushed my chair back, the sound scraping over marble. Dozens of eyes turned. I stood spine straight and left without a word. In the hallway, the air tasted like copper, my breath sharp and shallow. I kept walking until the night swallowed me outside. When Dad's car pulled up, I already knew the script. I climbed in, stared at my reflection in the glass, and braced for the blow. The drive was silent at first. Raindrops needled the windshield, streaking yellow streetlight into broken patterns. Lucas twirled the watch chain, smirking. Dad finally spoke. "You embarrassed me." I didn't answer. "You think walking away makes you strong? It makes you weak." Still, I said nothing. That was when his mouth twisted into a smile I'd seen before, the one he wore before a punishment. "Pull over," he told the driver. The tires hissed against wet pavement. The car jerked to a stop on the shoulder. "Out," he said. The rain had thickened into sheets. It hammered the roof like fists. "You want to leave the table?" Leave the car. 35 miles. Walk it. Lucas chuckled low and cruel. Good luck. I met Dad's eyes. For the first time in years, I didn't look away. Fine, I whispered. I opened the door. Rain swallowed me whole. Cold pierced through silk, through skin, straight to bone. I stood there as the car pulled away, taillights shrinking until they dissolved into the storm. The highway was empty. Water pooled around my shoes, sucking at the soles. My hair clung heavy against my face. Every breath came out as mist. I thought of being 10 years old, left behind at the stadium, sitting on that curb waiting for someone who never came. Tonight was the same lesson, just a bigger stage. Only this time, I wasn't waiting. Headlights flickered in the distance. My heart leapt, then dropped. The car didn't slow. It sped past spraying grit and water across my legs. Its red glow vanished into the black. I stood there, shaking, but not from fear. Something else, something harder, sharper, rose inside me. Then I heard it, a different engine, lower, steady. A black truck eased onto the shoulder ahead. It idled for a beat, then the headlights cut out. The driver's door opened. A tall figure stepped into the raincoat, unbothered posture calm. Miss Harlow Thomas Gray said. My breath hitched. He'd been at family events for years, always on the edges, a quiet shadow. I hadn't realized he still watched. What are you doing here? My voice cracked, but didn't break. He met my eyes. Rain dripped from his hair, slid down the line of his jaw. Making sure you're not alone. For the first time all night, heat spread through me. Not from the rain, not from shame, but from the realization that my father's power had slipped. I climbed into the truck. Warm air wrapped around me like a blanket. The door shut with a solid finality that sounded like a gavel. Through the windshield, the storm raged on white slashes across the road like tally marks. My father thought abandonment was strength. He believed silence was control. He was wrong. Tonight, silence would be mine. Thomas drove without asking questions. That was his way. No judgment, no pity, just space. The hum of the engine steadied me. My father thought he'd left me stranded, but really he'd left himself behind. We stopped at a small diner on the edge of town, neon sign buzzing, half the letters dead. Inside, the smell of coffee and fried onions wrapped around me. I slid into a booth leather seat, squeaking under my soaked dress. Thomas sat across from me, posture, precise hands folded. Food first, he said. The waitress poured steaming coffee. I wrapped my fingers around the mug, heat seeping into bones gone brittle from the rain. I stared at the dark liquid before whispering, he'll twist this. By morning, he'll tell everyone I stormed off that I disrespected him. Thomas's gaze held steady. Doesn't matter what he says. What matters is what you do next. That sentence clamped onto me like an anchor. For years, my father's version of reality had drowned mine. He told stories so loud no one remembered my voice. But now I had the truth and the silence to sharpen it. The next day, I moved into a small apartment Thomas had found. 1 bedroom, peeling paint, humming fridge. To me, it was a palace. For the first time, a lock clicked from the inside, not the outside. By the second day, the calls started. Unknown numbers lighting the screen. Voicemails full of his voice, first commands, then threats, then pleas. Come home. Don't embarrass me. You'll regret this. I didn't answer. Silence was my weapon now. Every missed call, every unanswered text was a blade he couldn't see but felt deeply. Instead, I began talking quietly to the people who mattered to him. Old family friends, colleagues at the Veterans Club, even Aunt Lorraine, who hadn't set foot in our house in a decade because she couldn't stomach the tension. I told them exactly what happened, how he'd left me 35 miles from home in the pouring rain, with no phone, no wallet, no way back. Their silences told me everything. Respect doesn't survive truth. It rots under it. And then came Lucas. It started with whispers. A supplier at the construction company complaining about unpaid invoices. A subcontractor saying checks bounced. I asked questions careful and quiet, and what I found made my chest tighten with something close to satisfaction. Lucas wasn't the golden boy anymore. He was drowning in debt, keeping the company afloat by leaning on Dad's name, Dad's reputation. Without that shield, he was finished. I sat in my new kitchen papers spread across the counter, coffee gone cold beside me. Numbers, contracts, overdue notices, each one another crack in the armor my father had built around his son. Thomas leaned against the window, arms crossed. You could bury them with this. I shook my head. No, I won't bury them. I'll let them bury themselves. All I have to do is hand them the mirror. So I did. I slipped documents into the right hand's board members, creditors, people who once toasted Lucas like he was the second coming of Richard Harlow. I didn't embellish. I didn't lie. I just handed over the truth. And I waited. The unraveling was almost quiet at first. A meeting canceled, a contract postponed, Lucas's smile looking tighter at the country club, then louder creditors calling clients, pulling out whispers in hallways about fraud and mismanagement. Dad's messages grew frantic, from commands to bargaining, from "you've disgraced me" to "we can fix this together." Each voicemail dripped with arrogance, crumbling into fear. I replayed one late at night, standing in my tiny apartment, rain tapping the window like fingers. His voice cracked at the edges. People are talking. Come home before they ruin us. I laughed, a low, bitter sound that surprised even me. They weren't ruining him. He'd done that himself. All I did was stop covering it up. By the end of the second week, Aunt Lorraine called me. Her voice was sharp, but for the first time, it wasn't angry at me. They're saying Richard abandoned you. That true, yes. I said simply. A long pause. Then I believe you. Those 3 words hit harder than all his punishments combined. I knew then it was working. The silence I kept with him, the truths I shared with others, it was cutting him down piece by piece. One night, Thomas watched me pace the apartment phone, buzzing with another voicemail. He finally said, "He's unraveling." "Good," I whispered. "Let him feel what silence tastes like." I pictured Dad in that big house pacing the hardwood floors, voice echoing off walls that once bowed to him. For the first time, he wasn't in control. For the first time, no one was listening. I didn't slam doors. I didn't scream. I didn't return home in tears like he expected. Instead, I waited, because the cruelest revenge isn't fire, it's emptiness, and he was choking on it. 2 weeks later, I stood outside the house I once called home. The paint looked duller, the windows darker, as if the walls themselves had inhaled the chaos and were slowly suffocating. Thomas idled the truck at the curb, hands steady on the wheel. "You sure you want to do this?" "Yes," I said. My voice didn't tremble. I walked up the front steps, rain dripping from the gutters, the smell of wet pine thick in the air. My hand curled around the cool brass of the doorbell. It rang longer than I remembered. When the door finally opened, Dad looked smaller, not physically, but in presence. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes red-rimmed. The man who once loomed like a monument now seemed hollowed out. "Claire," he said, relief and anger tangling in his tone. "You've made your point. Come back. Let's forget this." I didn't step inside. I placed something on the doorstep, the pocket watch. The chain clinked against stone sharp as a gavel. "Forget that you left me 35 miles from home in the pouring rain," I asked quietly. "Forget that silence was supposed to break me." He opened his mouth, but I cut him off. "People know now. They know who you are when no one's watching, and they're watching more closely than you think." His face blanched. The practiced authority slipped. For once, he had no script. I straightened the storm at my back. "This isn't my home anymore, and I'm not your lesson. You're mine." I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. Through the windshield, I saw him clutching the doorframe, swallowed by the silence he'd crafted for me my whole life. Only now it belonged to him. As Thomas drove us away, the air felt different, cleaner. I breathed deeply, tasting freedom that wasn't sharp or bitter, but steady calm. Betrayal had shaped me, but it didn't define me anymore. He wanted control. I gave him emptiness. He wanted obedience. I gave him truth. And in that quiet, my freedom roared louder than his voice ever did. I leaned my forehead against the glass city lights, stretching like a necklace of fire ahead of me. For the first time in years, I wasn't being measured, judged, or erased. I was just me. And that was enough. So tell me, what would hurt you more, losing money or losing the respect of everyone who once admired you?